I welcome all of you to our Wednesday night Bible study. Many of you, I'm sure, have been here for all three of these. If you are here for the first time, we're very, very pleased to have you and welcome you into the process of eating and also sharing in this particular kind of feeding. I am very, very happy with the way this particular ministry is unfolding. I have two announcements that I'd like to make before we have our prayer, begin the study of the second Beatitude. Linda Benson, who is a very wonderful part of our church, is also the Public Relations Director for the Red Cross, and she called this afternoon and said that there is a genuine blood emergency in Birmingham. They're having to cancel surgery in places, and so there's an emergency blood drive underway right now. They're going to leave the downtown office open until 10 o'clock. There will be added security, and they will be open in the morning at 7:30. The ones who gave in July are eligible again. Types needed are O and B, both positive and negative. Surgeries are being canceled due to this lack of blood. All churches are urged to get their word to the parishioner. I had hepatitis back in 1970. Went to all around the Mediterranean basin on an archaeological dig, and so I'm not qualified to answer this kind of call. I've always been somewhat hesitant to ask you to do something that I could not do, and yet that's really not the issue here. If this is a kind of generosity that you are capable of engaging in, I know the people that will get the blood eventually, and the Red Cross and all of the helpers of this community would bless you for responding. That's at 3rd Avenue and 23rd. We'll be open till 10 o'clock tonight and open early, 7:30. The other thing I'd like to do is to introduce to you tonight Dr. Paul Mostello. Paul, would you be good enough to stand? Dr. Mostello is Dr. Mostello is a new voice professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and he has graciously consented to be our interim organist choirmaster. Tim Smith, as you know, has resigned and gone back to San Antonio. Dr. Mostello just moved into our community recently. He and I were just talking that we feel the circumstances that led us to each other had the marks of providence. And he will begin with us, meeting with the choir tonight and playing and leading the choir Sunday. Paul, we welcome you into this part of St. Luke's life, and thank you for being willing to join us. We're delighted to have you. Let's center our lives in the one who gives us our life, and let us begin our study together by praying. Let us pray. Dear God, we ask you to invite us into your rest, to give us the grace to be still, and in that stillness to realize again the wonder of aliveness. As our breath moves quietly in and out, let us take that as a sign that you want us to be, that the great universe about us generously supports our lives, and that therefore we can have faith in your faith, that there is a reason for us to be here. There are things for us to do, truths for us to learn, and persons for us to love. I pray that what we experience this night between us will make the best in all of us grow. Help us to live into your word and to let your word live into us. We thank you for continuing creation and letting us be a part of it right up to this moment. Into your hands we give now this next hour, yea, the rest of our lives, through Christ our Lord. Amen. The focus of our Bible study for this fall is that relatively small passage of Scripture to be found in the 5th chapter of Matthew, the very first part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus addresses himself to the issue of human happiness. That they're called the Beatitudes because each of these 8 characteristics begin with the phrase, blessed are, last week, the poor in spirit, tonight, blessed are those that mourn. And blessedness is the biblical word for that sense of well-being, that sense of happiness, that profound kind of joy that is, I believe, if we're healthy and honest, the desire and hope of every one of us. I have described the Beatitudes in the last 2 sessions as Jesus' philosophy of happiness. I have suggested that here are the qualities that it seems like to me Jesus saying characterize the kind of person who can experience happiness. These are the gifts of God. These are not things that we have to heroically achieve. They are conditions that we have to allow the Holy One to bring into our lives. I've said 2 things as kind of underground assumptions about this study, about the Beatitudes. The first is that Jesus himself embodies these qualities. If they seem abstract, if they seem hard to get hold of, look at the one who walks the pages of the gospel, because here is an embodiment of the qualities of the genuinely happy human being. When we get through this study in November and we put it all together, I think you'll see that what we've really been doing is looking at a profile of Jesus of Nazareth, that the 8 qualities that we'll identify really did come together and lived among us in our kind of world in first century Palestine. So Jesus embodies these qualities that we're talking about. Second thing that I've been saying over and over again is that this philosophy of happiness may well clash with some of your conventional assumptions about this subject. There have been worlds of ideas put out as to what constitutes happiness. And it could well be that as you first look at this formulation of Jesus, that it doesn't square with the kinds of things that you have always believed constitute happiness. And therefore I have asked you, before you jump to negative conclusions, to allow the possibility that in this surprising configuration, there may well be secrets that we ourselves have not yet discovered. In my own experience with the new, that is, with things that clash with what I think I have already learned, my own experience is that those things are often very threatening to me. For example, the new threatens my pride. I don't like to discover that what I have put together may not be as true as something else, and so it's easy for me to be defensive. And when a new idea comes along and it clashes with what I've held, that I reject it out of court simply because I'm too proud to admit that I could be wrong and something else that's different could be right. The new also challenges my laziness, because it's much easier to simply stay with what you've already put together than to have to reorganize your thinking and maybe even reorganize your behavior in order to integrate or assimilate some new idea. So it takes energy to embrace the new and to adjust everything else that you've believed up to that point to this new thing. It is much easier to live by the credo, come weal, come woe, my status is quo. Now, we've all known people like that. I'm sure there's some even in the Episcopal Church, as I'm living into her life, that prefer that it stay the way it is to having to readjust to anything that is different. So it's easier in terms of my pride, it's easier in terms of my energy to not accommodate myself to the new, but I never grow unless I expose myself to something that I've never experienced, to something that I do not yet know. It is amazing how the unknown is the energy that enables us to grow. So we will simply be very, very fixated unless we are willing to confront the new, to allow for the possibility that there may be things about happiness that we ourselves do not know. So what I've asked you to do is to withhold any kind of ultimate judgment. I invite you to do with the Beatitudes what Jacob in the Old Testament did when he was about to cross over the brook Jabbok. And he suddenly found himself encountered by a mysterious figure. As the night wore on, it turned out to be an angel of God, but at first he didn't know what this was that was suddenly contending with him. But he began to struggle with this intrusion of the new. And as the dawn was about to break, this strange adversary tried to leave, and Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." That is, I'm going to stay with this once I've gotten into it, until I get to the bottom of it, until I learn what is the meaning of this event. I invite you to wrestle with the surprising elements in this particular formulation of happiness, because I've found in my experience that when I don't run away from the new, when I dare to expose myself to it and to grapple with it, that what at first may seem to be totally out of line with everything else I've known may oftentimes, through grappling, grow and mature into a genuine insight. Let me give you an illustration of this kind of thing that is not, it doesn't pertain precisely to my point of the Beatitudes, but it does illustrate how the new, the not yet experienced, once it's integrated, can add to new insight. Many years ago I was reading a seminal study on marital relationships in this country, put together by Letterly and Jackson. Some of you here perhaps will have read this book. It's called Mirages of Marriage. And in this book, the two researchers in one chapter describe 4 different kinds of marriage relationships and arrange them in a continuum from the very best kind of marriage to the very worst kind of marriage. And the continuum goes like this: that the very best kind of marriage is a relationship that is both satisfying and stable to both of the persons who are in it, where 2 people find delight in each other, where 2 people really do enable the other to grow, and where is that solid ground of stability that you don't have to get up every morning wondering if the bottom is going to drop out. The best kind of marriage, they say, is the satisfying and the stable relationship. The second best kind of marriage is a satisfying, unstable relationship. Here 2 people really do delight each other, but there are volatile elements here that you can't quite count on, and therefore that injects some kind of doubt, some kind of uncertainty, of which doesn't make for as good a marriage as number 1. Going now into the negative side, the third worst, or the third kind of marriage, we're getting over to the negative, is the unsatisfying, unstable. 2 people really don't feed each other, really don't delight each other, really don't help each other, and live in all kinds of turmoil and all kinds of uncertainty. And then the shocker to me, they said that the worst kind of marriage, the 4th category, is an unsatisfying, stable relationship. And when I first thought, I said, wait a minute, there's been a typographical error here. What could be worse than an unsatisfying, unstable relationship? It's really not feeding us, and it's up into all kinds of uncertainty. If I had been doing this continuum, I would have said right here is obviously the worst of all possibilities. And then I wrestled with it and began to think, and lo and behold, it dawned on me that in the instability of the third kind of marriage relationship, there lies the possibility that something might be done about the unsatisfying factor, and that in the instability, which means there can be change, there might come that shift of balances where it could become satisfying, could even move into category 1. And then it dawned on me that they were right in saying that the worst of all possibilities is a relationship that is inherently negative, that is destructive in both directions, but for some reason the people are locked into it, will not do anything about it, and therefore simply continue to destroy each other in a profoundly unsatisfying but stable relationship. I remembered when I finally grasped that new insight. My friend David Redding, a Presbyterian minister, began his sermon one time on Christian marriage with the statement, "God is not fooled by golden wedding anniversaries." And Then he went on to tell about having come back from a family gathering a few weeks before, where a couple had in fact been married for 50 years. But he said everybody that went to that celebration knew that this couple had loathed each other for about 47 years. They had been critical of each other. They had been destructive of each other. They had not occupied the same bedroom for decades. Their lives were in constant destructive conflict, but they had a lot of money. And neither one of them felt that they could afford monetarily to do anything about this, and so they stayed in a financially stable and yet profoundly emotionally unsatisfying relationship. And his point was that there are more ways to fail the ideal of marriage than divorce. Now please hear me. I've been through this trauma, so I know as well as anybody else that any time divorce happens, it is a tremendous, tremendous painful failure, more like amputation than anything else that I know. So I'm not saying that this is something that we should take lightly, but there are other ways to fail the Christian ideal beside failing till unto death do we part. Because the other parts of the Christian marriage ideal are that husband and wife shall leave father and mother, the two shall become one. And in an unsatisfying, stable relationship, it could be that the reason it's unsatisfying is one or the other has never left one of the parents. It could be that they've never worked at the task of really being harmoniously one with each other. So there are occasions where just staying together is as much a falling short of the glory as doing something about the longevity of it. Now, the point I want to make is that this was a new insight to me. When I first read it, I didn't like it. It didn't fit with the things that I had believed up to that point. But when, like Jacob with the angel, when I chose to wrestle with it, chose to see what it was that it was really trying to communicate, I gained a new insight that has helped me, frankly, in trying to work with lots of couples who are striving to bring their relationship into this first category. So, if we have a logo for this particular study, it is this photograph that I passed out the first night, which was taken, as you'll see if you read the inscription, by a Chinese photographer, deeply perplexed religiously. He was actually photographing some snow that was melting against the background of the black earth. And as he was developing the picture, suddenly he saw a likeness of Jesus Christ, an expression of great tenderness, and it was the catalyst that led him to a profound religious experience. And you'll notice that it says here that it may take you a long time to see what that Chinese photographer saw. It may take you a while in looking at these black and white images before that kind of countenance will become clear to you. But the point is that we have to stay with it like Jacob stayed with the angel. I am hearing more and more people say, I finally saw it. After looking at it for a long time, it finally suddenly became apparent to me. I confess to you that when I was first given this, I had to look at it for 2 hours without seeing anything that remotely looked like Jesus. And it really is not important. It's really not important how quickly this happens. The whole thing is to believe that if you will simply sit down before this and be open, that the truth comes as gift. And my suggestion is that the truth of the Beatitudes being an authentic path to happiness, if we will relate to these qualities the way I've invited you to relate to this enigmatic image, if we'll let it be and not try to make it happen, if you'll not come to judgment negatively too quickly, I'm hoping by the time that we have finished this study that it really will begin to dawn on you that there is in Jesus of Nazareth a wisdom about happiness that can genuinely help us, though it may be different than what we brought with us when we started this study. Okay, against that kind of background then, let's turn to the second Beatitude. Last week we began with the first quality, blessed are the poor in spirit, And I'm sure that at first when you read it and said, this is what happiness is supposed to be, it may not have made a lot of sense. But as we wrestled with it last week, I hope it began to come clear that what Jesus was really talking about here were those people who know they have not arrived. Those people who are willing to admit that there is yet more that they can experience. Those people who don't settle for just the past and the present, but also have an openness to the future. And therefore, the poor in spirit are the people who are not smug, they're not complacent, they're not arrogant. They are the folk who continue to adopt a stance that is willing to grow. And the first quality, it seems like to me, that makes for happiness is this sense that life has unending possibilities. None of us have come to the end of our development. And the challenge is to keep that stance of openness and hope toward all that lies out ahead. I was walking out of a cemetery in southern Kentucky where lots of the Claypools are buried, and I saw on an old tombstone a man's name, his dates, and then the inscription, he lived until he died. That's very similar to what Sam Keene said about his father. He lived up until the day he died. It's a wonderful thing to be said about any person, that you don't stop living as long as you have life and breath in your body. So the poor in spirit are the growers, the folk who are not smug and complacent and proud, the folk that know there is yet more to experience and more to grow. Happiness begins with that kind of humility. Now tonight, the quality may seem even more antithetical to a happiness than even poverty of spirit. Because the second quality Jesus has us focus on is, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And we say to ourselves, what on earth does mourning have to do with happiness? How can we take the sadness that we usually associate with an experience of mourning and somehow relate that to the gladness that we associate with an experience of happiness? Now, you probably know that there's a new term in our vocabulary today, the oxymoron, the putting together of things that seem to be totally opposites. Well, I'm sure that if you just look at it on the surface, the second beatitude seems to be an oxymoron. That is, it seems to say something that is absolutely self-contradictory. How can people who find themselves mired up in grief, who know what it is to mourn, how can we say that that quality is basic and essential to a capacity for happiness? Again, like Jacob with the angel, we're going to have to wrestle with the surface and try to find our way into some kind of deeper truth. As a first step toward that, I'd like for us to just simply take the experience of mourning, lift it up and look at it the way you would look at a diamond, examine what it is that is happening whenever a human being mourns, and ask ourselves, when does it happen, under what circumstances? When you see people mourning, what is really going on in the depths of this experience? Well, if you'll do that, it seems like to me that you'll always find out that every experience of mourning is connected to some value that you have ascribed to either a person or a thing or an institution. Whenever you find somebody mourning, you know that that person has loved something, and that something has happened to that beloved object or that beloved person. Either they have lost that person in death, or that person has become injured, or that person is not functioning up to full potential, or something has happened to that particular object. What I'm suggesting is that every time you find a person mourning, you know that you've got someone who positively connects and is concerned with something outside themselves that is the occasion of their mourning. Now tonight there are going to be 2 or 3 principles that I would like to set down, because I do think that they are basic and that they're applicable in many situations. I'm not a person to think that there are just an infinite number of absolutes, but there are a few things that I believe will always ring true. And one of those that I want to point out tonight is that the opposite of love is not hatred, but indifference. The opposite of love is not hatred, but indifference. Think about it. You never hate something that is unimportant to you. If you find yourself negatively incensed against some person, against some idea, against some institution, you can know full well that that is a significant issue to you. We don't get upset about things that don't matter to us. If there is no value commitment, then there's not going to be any kind of hatred. Now, what is true of hatred is also true of mourning. The opposite of love is not mourning, but indifference. Just as underneath an experience of hostility, you've got some kind of value commitment. So I think it is also true that every time you find somebody mourning, you know that that person has reached out to something beyond themselves and dared to say, that is important to me. What happens to that, what happens to that person makes a difference to me. You see, when we love, it means that we enlarge the circle of our affection. It means we take in something beside ourselves and say, this is now important to me, which means that we gain a resource. We've got another person or another object that can give us delight. It also means that we have enlarged the surface that can hurt. It means that we're now a bigger target for pain, because it's now not just me that I'm concerned about, but it's me and the beloved object, and if something happens to the beloved object, then that's going to affect me adversely. Therefore, if we'll look at the experience of mourning and look at it deeply, I think we can come to the conclusion that all mourners are lovers. That is, you wouldn't mourn if you didn't love. If you didn't care, you wouldn't mourn. Therefore, all mourners are lovers. And the same truth is that all lovers are potential mourners. The minute you reach out and include in what matters to you somebody or something other than yourself, then you have widened the possibility that your life can be enriched or that you can suffer, and that the pain of this world can get to you because of what's happening to somebody else, because that person, in a sense, has now become connected to your person. Love is the inclusion of care, and therefore it makes us a larger object of pain. Okay, the first thing then that I want to establish is that the experience of mourning is always based on some kind of experience of love. Now, people for generations, for centuries, have recognized this basic relationship between the two, that you cannot have the one without somehow having the other, that there is a relationship between these two experiences. But as people have looked at that and recognized that connection, many people have said, look, the possibility of mourning is so painful. The possibility that I'll get myself all bogged down in sadness because of the way that I have extended myself to include other people and other things. Therefore, this is so frightful a possibility that I'm not going to run that risk, and the clearest way not to do it is to decide not to love. There is a way to guarantee that you will never mourn, and that is never invest yourself in any kind of valuing of anything beyond the self. Simply say, I will not dare to put the parameters of my being around something other than my own narrow little self. And therefore, if you decide not to love, you will have effectively defended yourself against the possibility of mourning. Now, I'm sure you already realize that a whole world religious system has developed around that decision, that because mourning is so dangerous, the best thing to do, the most prudent thing to do, is never to love. I'm referring, of course, to the whole world religious system of Buddhism. You may or may not know how this very, very important religious option. You may not know how it came into existence, but here's the story. Back in before Christ, many centuries, there was a king who was old at the time that his youngest son was born. This king had seen so much of suffering, had seen so much of pain, had seen the shadow side of life so agonizingly, that when this little child was born, and he was very rich and very powerful by this time, he said to his wife, "I'm going to see that this child is shielded from all the things that have caused the rest of us so much pain. We will not let anything but pleasant experiences get through to this child. We'll not let him walk out into the world as it is. We'll keep him behind the palace walls. We'll screen out carefully the things that he can experience. He will know joy, he will know beauty, he will know truth, he will know wisdom, but he won't know the suffering and the agony that is also part of the world." And so the young Buddha, the young prince, was raised in a very, very protected atmosphere. Now, someone has commented that an overly protected child goes out into the world defenseless. Just like if a hothouse flower never learns to live in the ordinary atmosphere but is always protected, take that protection away and it hasn't built up immunities, it hadn't built up strength, and so it cannot survive. If I have any worry for the children of Mountain Brook, it's not that they're neglected. It's that we are so protective of what it is that we let happen to them that we run the danger of them having to go out into the world without the proper kinds of toughening defenses. The Buddha, as you would expect, could not be kept within the castle walls forever. None of us can keep our children carefully within the parameters of our protection. When he got to be a young adolescent, a young adult, he climbed out over the wall one day with one of his companions, and there he saw the bittersweet reality that makes up the world that everybody sees unless you have been protected. He had never seen a sick person. He had never seen a poor person. He had never seen a badly deformed person. He had never seen a starving person. He had never seen an excessively aged person. And when this one who had known nothing but positive experiences, when he suddenly was hit in the face with all of this painful negativity, it simply overwhelmed him. He could not take it in. He did not know how creatures could possibly survive under those kind of circumstances. And so that was the beginning of almost an obsessional search for how can one live in the midst of all this pain and survive. How on earth can one see all of this and still hold life together? And so for many years he went to many spiritual masters. He searched very deeply. He was a very profound person. And he finally had his famous experience of enlightenment, a thing that has happened to literally millions of human beings. And what the Buddha discovered in his enlightenment was that if he would detach himself from any kind of concern for any creature, for any condition, for anything whatsoever, that if he would pull into himself and not let any kind of attachment to anything else exist in his life, that then he would not suffer. In other words, he felt like that the root of all suffering was desire, and that if he could snuff out desire, if it really didn't matter to him what happened to anything else, then he would never know the experience of mourning. And of course that is true. It's like the old saw that if you don't expect anything, you can't be disappointed. If you don't have any investment in things going this way or that way, if it really doesn't matter to you, if nothing matters to you, then you won't know the pain that we usually associate with disappointment or with mourning or with grief. Now, a classic statement of this ultimate detachment, this complete indifference to the way that anything beyond the self is taking place. An example of that would be for me to get myself in the frame of mind tonight that if I got a call saying that Ann, my beloved wife, had been killed in an automobile accident, or I got a call saying that she had won the $5 million from the Reader's Digest, a sweepstakes, that one of those messages would make no more difference to me than the other. If something bad happened to her, if something good happened to her, if I was genuinely detached, it wouldn't make any difference. In fact, one of the Buddhist philosophers said, so relate to your wife and children that if they die tonight, it would not matter. Now, that is one of the ways that we can avoid the experience of mourning. If you absolutely pull in and say nothing whatsoever outside of me matters, if you choose not to love anything and not to care for anything, if there's no place where you say what happens to that makes a difference to me, then you have made yourself invulnerable to the experience of mourning and disappointment. You've heard me say that Carlyle Marney's redefinition of that promise in the book of Psalms, delight thyself in the Lord, and He will give you He will give you the desires of your heart. Marney says, delight yourself in the Lord, and He'll fix your water. That is, He'll make you want the things that will make for your joy. The Buddha would say in the same regard, if you follow His way, He will abolish your water. He will blow out your individual desiring, your individual preferences, so that nothing really matters. And when you see those images of the Buddha in his kind of stance of serenity, and always the eyes are virtually closed, it is as if the spirit is somewhere far beyond the world of 10,000 things. The serenity that is found down this way of handling the possibility of mourning is something that millions and millions of people, and not just in Asia, millions and millions of human beings have discovered the connection between mourning and loving, and they have decided that the risk of this is so great that I will simply cut the nerve at its very root. I will not care. I will not love. I will adopt a stance of detachment and indifference, and then I won't be vulnerable to being wounded when something outside myself has gotten wounded or gotten lost. Now, obviously, if you listen to the Beatitude of the night, the Buddha and Jesus are obviously saying two different things. Their understanding of how you get to happiness is going in two very different directions. Jesus is saying that happiness lies with the people who have the capacity to mourn. The Buddha is saying that the way to happiness is to simply have no desire and therefore give up any kind of attachment to anything. Now, I cannot decide for you tonight which you think is the most authentic. But what I can do is to simply draw the distinction and say to you that Jesus' approach to happiness is based on a very different set of assumptions, and it proceeds in a much different way than give up on everything and therefore retreat simply into yourself and don't care for anything whatsoever. The alternative that is found in the Beatitude, blessed are those that mourn, is based, I think, on three assumptions that are very seminal to the biblical revelation. The first is that God is love. This is the closest thing we have to a definition of the Holy One in Holy Scripture. That God is love, that the very heart of reality is this willingness to be concerned beyond the self, to take delight in things that are not one's own, to somehow reach out the circle and make it wider than just the naked self. To love is to care beyond the self. The second is that we humans are made in the image of this kind of God of love, so our happiness is going to come when we find a way to love authentically, to love holistically, to love honestly and directly. So God is love, we are made in the image of God, and reality is of one piece. What I mean by that is that there is no way to just partially experience reality. If you're going to experience reality, it all comes in on the same mechanism. The same eye that sees the beauty also is capable of seeing that which is ugly. When a musician trains his or her ears so that they can hear the wonderful nuances of wonderful melody, that same ear will be that much more sensitive to discordant sounds. The very capacity to experience the harmony also means that one is going to have to experience the disharmony. Now, I had a friend who was a chaplain in a mental hospital who told me once about a patient who worked very, very carefully for some time on trying to build a radio that would only pick up the good news and would only pick up the things out there in the broadcast world that happened to correspond to his taste. He wanted a radio that would screen out everything he didn't like and would bring in all that he did like, and remember where he was, and remember that he did not succeed in that kind of enterprise. You see, the truth is that if we say that we're not going to love because we want to avoid pain, then what we're doing is also closing off our possibilities to know the joy that comes from loving and comes from sharing affection beyond ourselves. Now, people for centuries have recognized that reality is of one piece and that you can't have the one and not have the other, that it's either everything or it's nothing. You're probably familiar with this old Greek mythology story where a woman comes to the river Styx. That was the legendary river that separated this life from the life where you went when you were dead. And she was met there by the friendly ferryman, whose task it was to take her across the river of death to the next world. And the ferryman said to her, "It is my obligation to tell every person who comes here that if they choose, they can drink from the spring called Lethe, L-E-T-H-E. It's what our word lethal comes from. You can drink from the spring Lethe. And what will happen if you drink is that everything that you've experienced up to now will be forgotten. It will simply block out everything that you have known in your earthly life." Well, the lady's eyes brightened. She said, "You mean if I drank of this that I would never have to remember all of the suffering and anguish that I've experienced?" And he said, "That's right. But remember, you wouldn't be able to recall any of your joy, any of the happy times you've had as well." She said, "Do you mean if I drank of this that I wouldn't have to remember any of the failures, mistakes that I've made?" He said, "That's right. But then you wouldn't be able to remember any of your achievements, any of the things that you're grateful for. You wouldn't be able to remember any of the positive." She said, "If I drank it, do you mean that I could forget all the people who have hated me and that I have hated?" And he said, "That's right. But you'll also forget all the people you've loved and all the people that loved you." And the story is that she looked a long time at that inviting way of blocking out all of the past and finally realized that the price that went with that kind of total blockage was too great to pay. And so she crossed the river without the aid of the amnesia of Lethe. Jesus would have been on the side of that kind of courage. Jesus would have said that the capacity to mourn is a sign that you have been open to the whole of reality, which means that you have not only made yourself available to that which is painful, but it also means that you are still open to the possibilities for joy that come from loving and come from being loved. And so the alternative that Jesus offers to us to happiness, the alternative that says that the people who have the capacity to mourn are the people who also keep the capacity for joy, that is really, in Jesus' contention, a wiser way to do our human life than the way of saying, because the possibility of mourning is so great when I love, I will not love at all. I think the wisest single statement that I have ever seen on this subject of how we're to deal with this bittersweet quantity that we call life comes from a follower of Jesus Christ. His name is Joseph Gallinger. He is a Catholic priest in Philadelphia, in Baltimore. He's a member of the Jesuit order. Any of you here know much about Roman Catholic life, you know that there's several different orders, and the Jesuits are the most highly educated. They are without a doubt the most intellectually sophisticated of all the scholars of the church. There's a wonderful story about an Italian peasant whose son wanted to be a priest, and so he went to a father and he said, "My son wants to become a priest." Said, "How long will he have to go to school to do it?" And so the man said, "Well, it just depends on what kind of order he wants to be in." Said, "If he wants to be a Franciscan, it'll only take 10 years. If he wants to be a Dominican, it'll take 12 years. But now if he wants to be a Jesuit like myself, it'll take 16 years." And the old peasant said, "Well, he better become a Jesuit. He is a little slow." That was not what the Jesuit wanted to hear. My point is the Jesuits are really profoundly well educated. And Father Gallinger, in commenting on this whole business of how we cope with the many facets of reality, made the statement in one of his books, "Our human choice is never between pain and no pain, but rather between the pain of loving and the pain of not loving." I honestly think this is the second principle that I would suggest to you has qualities that will ring out no matter what the particular circumstances. What he's suggesting is that the truth is our human choice is never to avoid pain altogether. Any way you try to do it, you're going to encounter pain. The only choice that we have is the pain that is the possibility when you enlarge your scope of affection and dare to love, versus the pain that is going to come to you if you make the Buddha choice and decide not to love. Now, it's true, if you decide not to love, you're not going to know the particular pain that we call mourning. You're not going to be disillusioned. But what about the pain of aloneness? What about the pain of being cut off? What about the pain of incredible isolation? Now, I know this is a kind of incredible image, but if I have an ingrown toenail, as I have had in the past, and it's really painful, and I get so frustrated, I go to a doctor and I said, "Would you just simply cut the nerve in my leg? I cannot stand this kind of pain again." He would say, "Well, now, it is true. If I cut the nerve, you won't ever have any more pain from your ingrown toenail. But remember, you're not going to feel anything. You're not going to know any pleasure. If you should spill hot water on that leg, you're not going to know it. If I cut the nerve to keep you from having that kind of pain, I'm also going to bring another kind of pain into your life, which is the pain of not being able to feel anything." And I have some friends who are very sophisticated modern parents. They have talked to their children from their earliest childhood about everything. And they told us once that their little girl, when she was about 13, had her first experience with her menstrual cramps. And she came in to her mother and said, "I want a hysterectomy." Now, most 13-year-old children wouldn't even know about that, but these sophisticated children did. Her first taste of this kind of pain was, "I want to get rid of the whole mechanism that makes this possible." And our friends had to say, "Honey, there is more involved. There is more involved than just avoiding this pain. If you do this, there are lots of other things that you're going to give up as well." And tonight I've tried to make it abundantly clear that when you dare to love, you open yourself to the possibility of a suffering that has nothing to do with you, but it has to do with the things that you love. There is a pain that is always a possibility when you dare to love. But friends, never forget, there is another kind of pain. The pain that comes from non-loving, it seems to me, cuts so across the very grain of the existence that is ours who are made in the image of a loving God. It's like the person who has food poisoning and says, well, it's too dangerous to ingest food. I'm going to give up on eating altogether. And so they don't have the pain of food poisoning, but they begin to feel the pains of starvation. Another kind of pain, the pain of not loving, is every bit as acute. In fact, it is even more devastating in terms of its potential on our human personality than the kind of risk that we run. So my point is, and I think it's Jesus' point, is that the price of indifference, the price of detachment is enormous. Because what we do when we choose not to love in order to avoid mourning is that we isolate ourselves. We find ourselves totally closed in on a house of mirrors. We find ourselves not having any kind of connectedness with things beyond ourselves. And we creatures, as the book says so clearly, it's not good for us to be alone. Our kind of cut-offness, if you'll think about it, if it is taken to the extreme, means that the worst pain of all is not the pain of hurting because someone we love hurts. It's the pain of not being who we are, and therefore having that terrible, terrible pain of self-contradiction. I went to junior high school with a really brilliant young man named Billy Lawrence, Nashville, Tennessee. We played on the same basketball team. He went to a different high school than I, went on to the Naval Academy, and frankly, I lost track of him. Well, about 7 years ago, I was asked to give the sermon at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and I was having dinner with the chaplains on Saturday night, and one of them said, the superintendent of the academy is a Tennessean. He's going to really be pleased to have another Tennessean to be speaking to us. And I didn't ask at that point anything else. Later in the meal, for some reason, Billy Lawrence's name came to my mind, and I said, by chance, have any of you all ever heard of a naval officer named Billy Lawrence? I knew he was outstanding. I remember he went to the academy, and they began to look funny at each other, and they said, do you mean Admiral William Lawrence? And I said, well, is he from Nashville? Yes. It turns out that my old junior high basketball buddy was at that point in time the superintendent of the Naval Academy. Well, the next day in chapel, when they introduced me, they said, you're not going to believe what this man said last night. He asked about, did we know Billy Lawrence? And of course, everybody died laughing. We got together after the service, had a warm embrace, wound up eating lunch, and told each other something of our stories in the years that had separated us. He'd been a Navy flyer in the Vietnam War, had been shot down over North Vietnam, had been incarcerated for 7 years, 5 of which was spent in absolute solitary confinement. And as he told me about what toll that kind of human existence had taken on him, it was absolutely awesome to hear. For 5 years he did not hear another human voice, did not see another human being, had no way to communicate with anyone, had to live solely in the confines of his own experience. And he told me the only way that he kept his sanity was using the memory of his connections in the past to stay alive. He said, I quoted to myself every scripture that I could ever remember. I would go to sleep at night trying to think of every person that I had ever known in every place I'd ever been. I would spend hours simply doing mathematics in my head. In other words, he was desperate for some kind of connection outside himself because, friends, the worst punishment we can devise for our kind of species, short of the capital punishment, is solitary confinement. Cut a person off from every other meaningful interaction with things outside the self. This house of mirrors in which we live by ourselves is not a place of happiness. If you and you alone inhabited this earth, if you had access to every material benefit that exists in this world, but you knew you had to inhabit this world in total and complete aloneness, if you can even fathom such an existence, you're bound to know that Genesis was right. It is not good for humankind to be alone. And so the choice of indifference, to retreat inside the self and say, nothing matters, I think is a violation of who we are and what it takes for us to fulfill ourselves. And whereas there are many people who haven't gone to the extreme of Buddhistic serenity and indifference, there are worlds of folk, and there have been times in my life that I have made this mistake, that instead of saying I won't have any concern for anything, I'll have no connections, there are people who have made their own comfort and their own preference and their own well-being the ultimate of their lives. They have never let anything else intrude upon their own particularly chosen form of comfort. And so those people don't let anything inside the circle of self but themselves, and where that is lived out, it does not make for joy. Frederick Buechner writes in one of his autobiographical pieces that when he was teaching at Lawrenceville School, his mother invited him into New York City to her apartment to have a meal one night. They hadn't seen each other for a while, and so they had both looked forward to these hours that they could be together. He had been at her apartment about 30 minutes. They were just having cocktails before supper when the telephone rang. And it was one of his young teaching colleagues at Lawrenceville School who told him that he had just gotten a call that his family in California had been in a very, very serious automobile wreck, that his mother, his father, and his sister were not at all assured of surviving, and they were calling him to come as quickly as he could to see what he might face. And he said, I realize that I'm intruding on your situation, but he said, I really desperately need to be with somebody with whom I can unpack my heart. Would you at all be willing to meet me at LaGuardia? I have a few hours, just so I can be with somebody I know to prepare myself for God knows what on this journey. Buechner says that a nobler person than himself would have quickly said, of course I'll be there. Whatever it is I'm doing is not as important as this tragedy that has intruded itself into your life. Of course I'll be there. But Buechner says instead of making that quick response, suddenly an enormous burden of memory came upon him. His own father had committed suicide when he was 10, and that had been so painful for all of his life. And he said the thoughts of having to get close again to enormous suffering were overwhelming. He knew that there was little he could say or do for his friend, and the thoughts of having to get back into that kind of pain were absolutely frightening. So he said he hesitated, and then he turned to tell his mother the situation. This is what's happened to my friend. He wants me to meet him at the airport. And she says, you're not going to let something interfere with this night that we have planned for so long, aren't you? Said, your friend's a grown man. He can paddle his own boat. We have planned this time for some time. Surely you're not going to let anything disrupt our evening. And it turned out that the friend on the other end heard the mother, sensed the hesitancy in Buechner's voice. So when he put his phone back to his ear, the man said, look, Freddie, I apologize for even calling. Of course, I shouldn't intrude into your life. Forget all about it. I'm very, very sorry that I've even bothered you. And with that, he hung up. Buechner said the night went as it had been planned. They went back to their cocktails. They sat down to a lovely prepared, beautifully served meal. There was soft music. There was candlelight. Everything was aesthetically perfect. But he said, I never passed a more miserable night in my whole life. It was as if I had ashes in my mouth, he said. You see, he had avoided the mourning of another. He had avoided involving himself in the pain of another person's life. He had put his own comfort and had allowed his mother to put her comfort ahead of everything else. And it did not lead to an evening of fulfillment. It led to an evening of absolute emptiness, a sense that he had failed, perhaps the purpose for which he had been born into this world for that night. He said that experience taught him that we don't gain happiness by avoiding every encounter with mourning. Therefore, to try to gather up what I've been trying to say tonight, let's restate the Beatitude to say, happy are those who do not let the risk of mourning keep them from loving. It It doesn't mean that you're to go out and look for mourning, to manufacture sadness, to run for things that are inherently painful. It doesn't mean that at all. But it means that you are the kind of person who, fully recognizing that when you love, you set yourself up for mourning, still have the courage that knows that there's more hope down the road of loving and connecting and enlarging the circle of our affection to include people and things and ideas and institutions. There is more down that road than you'll ever get by pulling in and being only concerned for yourself. Maybe the way to say it is, happy are those who are willing to brave mourning, who don't run away from love just because they realize that it is a genuinely risky business. If you have the capacity to mourn, if you really are the kind of person that is not turned off from loving by being willing to mourn, then I think the benefits in conclusion are two. It means that you still have access to joy. You have not cut the nerve to avoid the pain that means you can't feel anything. You have not drunk of lethe so that in trying to get rid of the bad, you have also lost all contact with the good. Realizing that it takes both and that we only have one mechanism to receive, you still have access to joy. Interestingly enough, when mourning is embraced as Jacob embraced the angel, though it's never something we seek, it is never something that we go out and deliberately want to have. When you live into the experience of sadness that comes from loving, it has a way of enlarging you, of revealing the love that is underneath the mourning. It has a way of inspiring you to grow. It has a way of ennobling you. I'd like to end by bearing my own simple witness that an experience of mourning in relation to the sickness and death of a little girl, the last thing in the world I ever wanted to happen, when I didn't run from it, when I didn't try to evade it or dodge it through alcohol or to somehow steel myself against feeling what I had to feel, when I embraced what it was to have loved a child with all my heart and then to not be able to save her life or to keep her from suffering. When I lived into that, I came to a new awareness of what an incredible value her life had always been, of how I had tended to take for granted the way that life had been given to me. Gibran says that ever it has been that love knows not its own depths until the moment of separation. I did not realize how much I loved that little girl until I went through the experience of having to change the way I could relate to her. Now, you could easily let that embitter you. It can make you feel guilty and say, why didn't I love her more? Or it can open in you a capacity to love everybody else that is left. It can open a way for you not to take for granted a single day or a single hour. I would have to say that I did not seek mourning, but when I engaged mourning, it actually enlarged my capacity to love, to appreciate, to live with the mystery of existence. So mourning is not something that we do just because we want to do it. When it comes, it has the power to deepen our appreciation of how good life was and how good life is and how good life can be. Therefore, I pray for you the courage that is willing to mourn, because out of that courage will come the capacity to know the joy of life as well. We can see stars in the darkness that we'd never see in the sunshine. Mourning is not the last thing if it's embraced in hope. Happy, then, are those who know it,